And I think some of the stories that you were going to bring up have to do with this deep trust in the life and well-being of that child, even if you have to let go. Otherwise, I don't think you can get out of bed in the morning.
So one of the things that's on my mind, Andi, is the relationship between mothers and children. We're in Breshit, we're in the Parshiot, the Torah portions in Genesis, that are really about family relationships. Recently, we read of Rebecca making the bold move of leaving her parents and traveling with a strange man to a strange land to wed Yitzchak. And there's a verse that often gets overlooked where her mother actually resists and wants to wait a while for her to be prepared, and then says, let us ask the girl, the lass, right, which is very unusual. And then they call her in and they said, will you go? And she says, Elech, which reminds us of Lech Lecha. She says, I will go, which is very much an echo of Avram saying, being commanded to leave his land. And so we never hear of her mother again, but there's a lingering poignancy of the mother who's separating from her daughter, never to see her again. And then, of course, Rebecca is going to live through a similar separation when she recognizes that her son Jacob's life is in danger from her other son, from his twin Esav. And she works out this scheme or this idea that he'll go back to her homeland, right? So a reverse Lech Lecha, to look for a wife, and she'll never see him again, right? So we have these two threads connecting a daughter who leaves her mother and a son who leaves his mother, and never to be reunited. And there's really a painful sense of separation, of estrangement. There's no WhatsApp, there are no phone calls. Right. We don't know if letters are being written. And there's a sense of loss, even if it's for the natural progression of life, marriage and children, right? This sense of a severance, of a tie. I couldn't help but think of your drawings around the umbilical cord connecting mother and soldier son. And what's palpable there is both the connection and the sense of separation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm going to diverge for 1 second, because when you were speaking, one of the things I thought of that I think, this is just the relevance of this particular war, which is that your sons come home and they don't come to their mothers, they come to their wives and their children. And so there's this tension, which is, of course, you want your boy to go home to his wife and his kids, but you also want to touch him and bless him and see him again. And I think that this situation here has brought that into super sharp focus. But at the time when I made these, my sons weren't married. And again, I'll just sort of hammer home that I took it very personally. I was very deeply aware of my angst for when my boys were in. There's a saying that I love that says, making the decision to have a child is to forever have your heart go walking around outside your body. If it was raining, all I could think of was that my son was soaked in the mud somewhere. So first of all, these are etchings. These are done on metal plates with acid. It's a whole process, but it allows you to print more than one. And then the umbilical cord is done with water. And the funny thing is that I did this when my first son went in. He's in tanks. My second son is in Sanchanim. He's in paratroopers. So he actually wears all this stuff in these funny shower caps. It doesn't matter where they are and how many days you haven't heard from them. You're so attached to them and what they're going through. I usually can't wait for winter to come here. Like, I'm so excited when it finally rains. But this year, that excitement is so tempered by the fact that that means all these boys are going to be in the cold and the wet. My oldest son is in tanks. He's a tank commander of a Merkava Arba. So that's what this one is about. And then the next son was in paratroopers in Sanchanim. they all jump out of an airplane as part of their basic training. And I tried to explain to somebody how that experience as a mother of a son felt. And the closest thing I could say is that, remember when your kids are little and they go too high in the swing and you feel your stomach drop? That's sort of how I would have reacted had I seen it. I was so glad he came home. He goes, Mom, I did the jump. You weren't invited. I was like, thank God.
You have a specific son with a specific name and a specific relationship. And yet what I'm seeing here is all the mothers have the same face, right? The sons are, we don't see their faces. There's something universal. Like, you're taking your own particular experience and you're saying everyone has this umbilical cord, which is very jarring.
Yeah.
The red, which reminds us of blood coming out from between their legs, right? It's a very feminine and feminist portrayal. There's almost something generic in the relationship, and yet your relationship is so individual and personal.
I think that's part of what's unifying the country right now, is that we're all mothers of soldiers. Even if it's your grandson or your next door neighbors, we're all going through the same pain. It was very deliberate that they shouldn't all be different. Over the years, when, because I considered myself like an outsider Israeli, I made Aliyah when I was 40, I didn't grow up here. And it's very interesting that even fourth generation Israelis, when they see this, especially women, they start to cry. Everyone knows this feeling. And the last one in the series was one after Sukeitan, and it's so relevant now, when we discovered that there were these tunnels, and the idea that your child would be in this dark, wet tunnel and maybe not come out. My reaction, and obviously that's Gaza in the background, was the horror, really, of thinking of your child below the earth in these tunnels was so intense. All this kind of work helps me process.
I find it interesting also, the women are quite young. And if you're talking about mothers of soldiers, of course, they can't be this young. And yet we all revert back to, this could be a mother giving birth to a baby. For the mother, the child always remains her baby, right? There's always a sense of remembering that moment of birth never really passes. And it brings me to two stories in the biblical text, I think, that I want to tie in here. One is Yocheved, right, who after she gives birth to Moshe at such a dark, tenuous time in the history of our people, really, again, a very, very dark time. It's not clear how we're going to escape from the bondage of Egypt. They're killing babies. And she puts her baby in a basket and she puts him out to float on the Nile, not knowing what's going to happen, exposing him both to potential danger and salvation. So he's in a dark space, a dark enclosed space. His mother has put him there for his own good, for the good of the people maybe, and not knowing where that's going to go. And we're all Yochevedes to some degree when we send our children off to the army to fight, recognizing that there's no choice and at the same time hoping that it's going to lead to salvation. And I have 4 daughters, so my experience is very different. 2 of my daughters were in intelligence. The third was in a combat unit, but she's not actively being called out. But her husband's in the army, right? My youngest is going in January to do a job. It's called Tatzpitanit, which is a kind of surveyor of the borders. And they paid a very heavy price in the beginning of the war. And so it's a different experience, but nonetheless, the umbilical cord still stretches. And I think that's what's this war in particular has highlighted both the courage of women, the bravery of women fighting in the combat units, and the loss of women.
There's a whole nother chapter, which I'm now seeing up close and personal, which is these wives that have been home now, some of them for 5-6 weeks with little children and no partner. And they're holding up the fort. And because the children are so small, they have to project that everything is okay. Daddy's okay. They have to pretend hour by hour, day by day, that everything's okay. At some point, I'm going to do something about these heroines.
Just before I walked into your house, I ran into a friend who has 4 sons in the army and a son-in-law. And we talked about the reentry point and how hard that is, right? That I remember when my husband would do reserves and it wasn't the war, but you at some point begin to get used to doing everything alone. And then you have a way of doing it and you've restructured maybe, and you're now dealing with the children who are entering new phases of development that your husband hasn't been, whether it's toilet training, whether it's taking away a pacifier, whether it's homework, losing a tooth,
whatever.
And you've now experienced that and directed the child, and then your partner comes back and you have to negotiate this re-entry.
Make a space
you have to
for
make
him.
Space
Yeah.
after, it's complicated. And I think there's going to be a lot of challenge in terms of re-entering all the men, even as we want that more than anything, right? That sense of separation and reconnection.
You're also talking about trust that mothers and wives have. This ability to let go, like let it go to the universe, to God, to whatever, that they're going to be okay. Otherwise, I don't think you can get out of bed in the morning. And I think some of the stories that you were going to bring up have to do with this deep trust in the life and well-being of that child, even if you have to let go.
So I think a lot of the stories in the Tanakh are really about letting children go and letting them go on their own journey. And there's not always a happy ending. We'll go back to Jacob and Esau, right? Jacob never sees his mother again. And there's a reconciliation of sorts with his brother, but not a full reconciliation. And certain things are then going to play out with his own children, with estrangement and hostility and animosity and a separation between Jacob and Joseph. There we have a father and a son who are separated for 22 years. Of course, he thinks he's dead, and then he comes back, right? How do you live with that? On one hand, Jacob is told that Joseph is no longer alive, but you feel like Jacob struggles to accept that reality. And how long do you wait for your son to return, even against all odds? And then his son suddenly returns, and the family is no longer the same, and the family is very different. So I think that story of Jacob and the sons is also a story about sibling rivalry and hostility and broken family relationships. But if we pare it down, it's about a very long separation and then a reconnection and coming back from the dead, and how do you re-enter that space? And I think it's very powerful, and it's very beautiful, where he says to his brothers, Ani Yosef ha'od avichai, I am Joseph, is my father alive. But when they reconnect, there's this very poignant moment, but you don't feel they fully reconnect, right? There's still a kind of separation. Joseph goes on to lead Egypt. Jacob is in Goshen, right? After this war is over, families will have had different experiences.
Oh, boy.
And how do you bring those back together? And here we have this umbilical cord, and we're connected, and we never lose the connection. And yet there can be a fraying of the connection because such different experiences are being had. And it brings out resentments and hostilities and fears and anxiety and anger and hope and yearning and all of this, such intense
How about,
emotions.
like, when you were talking, all I could think of was the hostages. Whatever person you get back, if you're the mother or the father or the wife or the brother, that is not going to be the same person. Not by a long shot.
And if we go back to your drawing, I'll say etching, is this dark hole, right? That sense of when you go down into the dark hole, when you come back into the light, right? What are you bringing with you from the darkness? And the country is not going to be the same, not just these hostages. We're already not the same. And another thing, just going back to the first etching, I couldn't help but notice, I think you've drawn it, and I hope this was not your experience, but the dark holes around the eyes, right? There's a darkness.
Who's sleeping?
Who's sleeping? And maybe a little bit of a hardness and a sadness, right? So there's almost like the eyes are burning into me when I look at that picture with a kind of intensity and darkness and sadness. And some of that is going to come back also, even in the best case scenarios. So like you said, who is sleeping, but also what is being internalized as we each go through this very difficult separation and then hopefully reconciliation. So Andi, we've talked about the mothers and the wives, the heroism, the courage, the umbilical cord stretching. We've talked about the unknown of the tunnels. We've talked about the hostages. There's really one more story I want to bring up. It's the children who no longer have parents, no longer have one parent, no longer have both parents. I had said to you when we started thinking about learning together the intersection of art and Torah, what came to my mind was Abaye. Abaye was an Amoraic sage in Babylonia in the 4th century. He's one of the greats. He lives towards the end of the Talmudic period, but he is often quoted in the Talmud. He has tremendous teachings of halacha. He lost his mother and his father, so he's really an orphan. And he's raised by the man who becomes his mentor, Rava. He also has a nursemaid. And what's really beautiful about his relationship with his nursemaid is he calls her mother. And he repeatedly quotes her in the Talmud. In fact, it's actually quite astonishing. Amra li aim, mother told me. Now, unless you know mother died, his biological mother died in childbirth, well, that's cute that he's quoting his mother. But once you recognize he's quoting his nurse, Amra li aim. And what does he quote her? What's interesting is where we find the nurse coming up in the Talmud. A little bit of halakha. It's one of the things where Abaye in the tractate Yoma says to his colleagues, my mother said that a boy under 13 and a girl under 12 shouldn't fast, right? This idea of when it becomes healthy or possible for a child to fast without danger. So he gets that from mother, from Aim, his nurse, whose name I don't believe we know, because why would we know, right? Like, again, that picture of all the mothers looking the same, right? Their mother, that's just her name. And often he quotes her with folk remedies, this idea of she gives him these tools or this information that mothers usually pass to daughters. And here is a mother passing it on to her son, to her foster son. And just to give a little bit of examples, he's talking about after circumcision, how to heal the wound, right? So here's something that's uniquely male, but who would be treating the wound? The mother. The last example I want to give is really my favorite because it reminds me of Mary Had a Little Lamb. There was a concern in the time of the Talmud that there were demons in the latrines and the outhouses, and you shouldn't go to the latrine alone because a demon might attack you. You should only go with a partner, another person going with you. I feel like Abaye's nursemaid is concerned about the demons in the latrine in the way we'd be concerned about sending a child into a public restroom alone. And she raised a little lamb to follow him into the latrine, right? So he has this little lamb, and the idea is that demons are afraid of lambs or sheep or goats, doesn't matter. And I feel like it has a little bell around his neck, and he follows Abaye wherever Abaye goes as a young child to protect him, right? So she's so prescient in recognizing, right, all she wants to do is protect this child who has become essentially her foster child. And she comes up with a wonderful solution for when she can't be with him, that he always has this little pet with him that will protect him and make him feel less alone. Two things come to mind as you're talking. Tzitzit, the Tzitzit project, which women are tying tzitzit because they can't keep up with the supply and demand. Tens of thousands of soldiers want to wear tzitzit as they go into battle. And my cousin Yael had a lone soldier, I want to name David Mittelman. He was from an ultra-Orthodox family. He left his family to serve in Golani. He fell in the first hour of the war. She came up with such a beautiful idea for memorializing him. These little diskettes, right? Every soldier has a diskette, a little disc, a metal disc with their name on it. They're producing Shema Yisrael in memory of David Mittelman, and 80,000 have already gone out, and more are being ordered. And secular, religious, like everyone wants to have protection in some way. And this idea of going back to our Jewish rituals, our Jewish prayers, right? It ties back into this idea of having the tzitzit or the diskit protection. And all we want to do is protect.
Yeah, for sure. And that's something I explore in a lot of the pieces that I do.